All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today for TNP's webinar, Adapting in Times of Crisis, Contingency Planning. My name is Christina Krishbaum. I'm the Program Manager for TNP, and I thank you so much for joining us today. We have on the webinar today, David Greco of Social Sector Partners and Kids, I'm gonna say it wrong, forgive me, All-Star Kids. Right?
All-Star
Helping Kids. All-Stars Helping Kids. See, I'm going to get it right someday. Forgive me. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We do want to take a moment today to observe a moment of silence to honor the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless more who have suffered due to the systemic inequities and structural racism in our world. So I'd like to take that moment right now, and hopefully all of you will join us in a moment of silence as well. Thank you very much for taking that moment. TNP would like to let everyone know that we stand in solidarity with all who work on the front lines of racial, economic, and social justice movements in our communities. We stand with you as allies, and we look forward to amplifying efforts to combat the systemic racism in our communities. If you have any further information you'd like to share with us, please do so, but we will be seeking out that information and sharing it for all of you. So thank you very much for sharing in that moment with us. Moving on to our topic at hand, because it is trying times all around. First up, we want to thank our sponsors for our webinars. We have a couple of wonderful sponsors who have prioritized the webinars and providing this information for free for all of the nonprofit organizations out there. So we do want to acknowledge the Josephine S. Gumbinder Foundation for sponsoring the webinars, and also International City Bank. Specifically, we want to thank Michael Miller and Janet Nelson of International City Bank for bringing forth some funding and some sponsorship specifically for this webinar on scenario planning. Perfect timing for that. So we do want to thank our sponsors. For those of you who attended our webinar on Tuesday on reopening Long Beach nonprofits, the video is posted up on our website. That's tnpsocal.org. And I'd also like to mention that we are also holding another webinar June 17th, and this one is going to be focusing on meaningful data. So how do you collect and utilize data, especially in light of all that's happening both with COVID and with the social justice movements? How is this data really going to make your case for your organization, and how can you make meaningful conversations out of that data? That will be held by Michelle Molina on June 17th. It'll go up on our website today, and you'll get a link for registration coming soon. So just in case, if you have missed any of our prior webinars, TNP has hosted 9 webinars and I believe 10 HR check-ins since March 16th. So we've been busy, but they're all up on our website. So tnpsocal.org, you can access all of those. And I'm gonna put that in the chat as well. So if you wanna watch any of them, you're more than welcome to. You can share those out. If you're looking for a specific piece of information and you don't wanna go through about 20 hours of webinar, and I understand that, send us an email, info@tnpsocal.org, and ask us, hey, where can I find that resource? And we'll try and find where it is in any of the webinars and send that information over to you. So for now, I'd like to turn things over to David Greco, Executive Director of All Stars Helping Kids and founder of Social Sector Partners. Some of you may have attended TNP's, one of our very first webinars that was actually held with David all the way those many months ago, back in March, on sustainability during uncertain times. And this is a next kind of big step in looking at long-term sustainability, but also looking at what's the short term, what's our long term, what triggers us to go to plan B and plan C. So David, thank you so much for joining us again, for sharing your guidance and your wisdom through all of this. And I just want to mention for everybody, if you have questions, please post them up in that Q&A. We will be monitoring that, and we'll try to get to all your questions throughout the session. For now, David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Christina. Thank you, Christina, and thank you to the whole team at the Nonprofit Partnership. It's always great to be working with you again. I also wanted to say thank you for everybody for taking time out of, I know just must be a crazy busy schedule for all of you to join with us here today. You know, I know it's been a difficult past few days, past few months for folks, and Christina and I were just talking kind of before the webinar started that I think with everything going on, I know for me, one of the areas where I continue to find a lot of encouragement and inspiration and hope is in the work of our nonprofit partners and the grantees and organizations that we work with here, as well as all of the organizations I've known and worked with over the years. For me, I just think that what I'm seeing is just resiliency, determination, continuing to move forward, just an absolute refusal to quit. And that's what I've always loved about this sector, and that's why I've been in this space for almost 30 years now, is because I just think that that attitude, that approach, regardless of the challenges, regardless of the fears, regardless of the uncertainties, you all are, stand committed to your mission. Instead of stepping back, you're all stepping up, you're adapting, you're innovating, you're doing all the things that oftentimes I think nonprofits are criticized for not doing. But we're an amazingly resilient, innovative sector, and I'm just proud to be part of it. So welcome everyone here today. Again, my name is David Greco. I currently serve as Executive Director for an organization called All Stars Helping Kids. It's up here in the Bay Area in Santa Clara, California. And we provide grants, general operating support grants for nonprofits that are tackling, trying to disrupt the cycle of poverty for Bay Area youth. We run an accelerator program that's 3 years of general operating support, coaching, capacity building trainings, connection, that really acts as an accelerator for early stage startup nonprofits who are addressing, again, trying to address this kind of disrupting the cycle of poverty. When I'm not doing my day job, I also do speak a lot on nonprofit, particularly nonprofit finance, nonprofit sustainability, and that's the company Social Sectors Partners, where I do kind of my kind of non-all-stars work. So that's why you have two names down there. But I'll give you all my contact information later, but feel free to reach out to me. For folks that are on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or things like that, you can follow me on any of those medium. On Twitter, my handle's right here at David R. Greco. So folks feel they want to tweet away during the session, please feel free to take a shot, take a picture of the screen and post it if you want. And my information, again, will be at the end. As Christina mentioned, we will be sharing all of these slides with everyone. So everyone's going to get a copy of the presentation and for that. So if there's any questions, if people need a copy, the nonprofit partnership will be providing that for everyone. All right, so I know I see some names in the chat box and all where folks had joined us a couple of weeks ago when we did our first session, and so I'm gonna just touch upon a couple things we've done there. But for the folks who weren't in that session, don't worry. There's nothing that you'll miss that you'll need for today. But I just want to kind of highlight a couple things we kind of talked about. I just think it's good advice, always kind of good things to reiterate before we get into this idea of contingency planning. And so one of the things that we've been working with a lot of our nonprofit grantees and our nonprofit partners is this idea that that this is kind of what we call go time, right? This is like, okay, it's time to go, the game's on, we got to get out there and play. Because one of the things that I noticed back, and when I was doing this work, I was at Nonprofit Finance Fund in 2008 when the Great Recession hit, in particularly into 2009, lasted into 2010. One of the things that I saw back then is that the organizations that responded quickly, they recognized this is something really serious, this is going to be long-term, and they made immediate adjustments. Sometimes they were tough calls. Sometimes they had to cut staff, reduce programming, kind of shrink back. But those groups who made those adjustments early on, they were the ones that were able to really come out of that recession much stronger organizations. It was the organizations that said, hey, we're going to ride this out. we'll kind of see what happens. We'll kind of play it by ear, and but give it a couple months, and things will return to normal. Well, of course, we know they didn't return to normal, and so consequently, I think those groups were a lot of the groups by 2014, 2015, they were in a lot of trouble, and that's when you started to see a lot of bankruptcies happening, and nonprofits actually ended up shutting their doors because whatever reserves, whatever money they had, they kind of burned through everything. And then by 2014, 2015, they were just depleted and eventually kind of ended up closing doors. So for now, I just really recommend the groups that, that why we have to obviously be focused on our mission, driven by purpose, driven by compassion. Now is the time to take action. And if there's tough, hard decisions you need to make, do it now, because I continue to say that our goal here is really live to fight another day. And that's the main thing, is that the work we are focusing on, the kind of economic and social inequalities, kind of, these kind of long-term systemic issues that our society is facing, right? These are not going to be solved here today or tomorrow. So we need to ensure that the organization and the mission and the work that we're doing continues to be here, past tomorrow, past next week, into next year, and a year beyond that, and a year beyond that. This is a long-term strategy. We need to take the long view on this if we wanted to continue to focus our work. And so sometimes that will require making some difficult decisions. And we're going to talk about some tools to help us do that today. The other thing I think that's really obvious is obviously cash, right? In this circumstance where fundraising events have been canceled, fundraising has been disrupted, donors are shifting funding, other foundations are pulling back, right? This idea of how much cash do you have, and really understanding how much of that cash is actually unrestricted, right? How much, because you can't pay your salary and light bills with money that's in your endowment. You can't pay your salary and light bills with money that's set aside for 2021. So really understanding what cash is actually available for you here today. And this is one thing I think that for me, I continue to emphasize, is this difference between a cash flow problem, which is really a timing issue. That is oftentimes when you do work, you submit an invoice, and then the city or state says, we're going to pay you in 3 months. Or maybe you have a donor who's made a pledge but says, we need to do some tax planning and talk to our accountant first. It's going to take 8 to 12 weeks before you get the check, right? In those cases, the money's coming in, but it's not here yet. And so you have some cash on hand that just helps you bridge those timing delays. And when that money comes in, it kind of replenishes your stock. That is a cash flow or a timing issue. A cash problem is where you just don't have the money, right? There's been somebody cut your funding, there was an unexpected expense, and you just don't have the cash that's available for that. And there's nothing that you see coming in. I see a lot of nonprofit leaders say, oh, this is just a timing, it's just a cash flow problem. And it's really not. It's actually a fundamental cash problem. What I often talk about is a structural deficit. So really understanding, is this really a cash flow timing issue? Or is this something where we just really don't have the money for this? And this is really a cash problem, because they have very different solutions about how you can address it and what the kind of options are for you as an organization. And I've seen one of the things, I've talked earlier about this kind of idea of resiliency and innovation and adaptation. And that's what I've seen out there. I think a lot of groups are fundamentally really rethinking their business model, because they recognize that, kind of this issue that's happened with COVID and moving things online, it's presented a lot of challenges, but for some groups, it's really presented opportunities. So really, how do we rethink our business model? And are there ways that we can kind of think about monetizing our business model in a way we just had never really thought about before? And so some of this idea of what does success really look like? What is it really that you're trying to achieve? And don't get so attached to the means of how that has happened, but focusing really on that long-term impact that you're trying to achieve. Because to me, that's really it. So stop being afraid to kind of pull back, rethink, reshift, as long as you continue to stay focused on that key mission. Now, with the business model, ultimately, I you hear other groups talk about this, that the goal is what we call the reliable recurring revenue. Right? And that's our goal, whether that's from fundraising, from earned revenue, from whatever the various sources are, or do we have that reliable recurring revenue? And for many groups, that's been significantly disrupted with this crisis. So how is it that we can reconfigure and rethink about our business models? We're not going to talk about a lot about that today because I think that's a longer term process for a lot of groups, but this is definitely something you need to be thinking about and not just think about, oh, we shifted online and now we're doing some programs, but as soon as things go back to normal, we'll shift back to our old model. Again, I don't know what the new normal is going to look like, but it definitely will not look like 6 to 8 months ago. It's going to be it's totally different. And with the elections coming up next year, you know, we really don't know what the situation is. So prepare for the worst. Think about really how you can adapt and really fundamentally shift the work that you're doing. And this is kind of a similar type of thing. I think that when you're thinking about it, that recognizing the situation now, not this kind of waiting till the wolf is at the door kind of mentality. So part of this is really thinking about assessing your risk, you know, putting your plans together. And this is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. The last piece I want to talk about before I actually get into our kind of contingency planning for session for today is really what are the financial tools and what are the financial kind of documents, sources of data that you're having to help influence decision making. While things like audits and 990s are great, we need to remember most of those are at least at this point 6 months old, you know, if not even older, 12 or even in some cases 18 months old, right? So they're not necessarily the most relevant kind of, you know, current documents. And so really, what in addition to that, what are some of the current year-to-date actuals you have? How does that compare to your budget? And most people, when they're doing budget reforecast, they really focus on the income statement, or revenue and our expenses or surplus deficit. But one of the things I recommend is that when you're thinking about doing these kind of reforecast and replanning, contingency planning we're talking about today, is also look at how does that impact our balance sheet. In particular, how does that impact your available cash on hand, your kind of receivables, money that's owed to you, right? What about the money you need to pay out to others? So how does these shifts in your business model and these kind of changes and reforecast ultimately flow down to your long-term financial savings, which is on your balance sheet? They're your net assets or your net worth. And so also really, I often say to also recommend reforecasting the balance sheet as well. And we do that every month. We do both the income statement and balance sheet for us. So we really have at all times, we really understand how much assets we really have to kind of manage through this crisis. But in the end, these are only tools. These are only data, right? They're not going to make decisions for you. It'd be wonderful if we could take all of our budgets and 990s and audits, feed it into a machine, and it tells you exactly what to do. But sadly, that does not exist. If I could create that, I'd probably be a very wealthy individual, but I'm not. So, you know, at the end of the day, you still are the executive director, the development director, the program director, the board members who need to make decisions. And so this data is here to inform that decision, but it's not going to tell you what to do. And so this is still the part where it's part art, part science. All right. So with that, unless there's any kind of burning questions, because I'll just really kind of then jump into this quick look at kind of scenario and contingency planning, if that's good for folks. All right. So one of the things I want to talk about before we get into this is some terminology. You hear terms like strategic planning, scenario planning, contingency planning, right? And we oftentimes group them all together and kind of think of them as the same thing. And that's not really the case. When you think about like strategic planning, or even definitely, you know, that's something that's a very kind of deep, long-term formal process of really developing plans over a much longer period of time. And same thing with scenario planning. Scenario planning is usually something where you're thinking about kind of gradual change, where you think about, okay, we know this funding stream is eventually, curling down. The state is shifting how it's funding regional centers, and that's going to impact how we're going to get funded. And, there's other changes in terms of how people are funding, but that gives it, that's still further down on the horizon. And so what we're doing now is trying to develop some ideas of different scenarios that could potentially play out depending on how that funding shift or demographic shift usually unfolds. But contingency planning is really much more around kind of a sudden, drastic turn of events, much like we've seen over the last few months, right? It's really your this kind of plan B, worst case scenario. It's oftentimes a much kind of quicker process. It could be emergencies, disasters, or things like a kind of economic disruption that we're facing here today. So I'm going to talk many ways. The things I'm going to show today are, I don't want to call them quite back of the envelope, but they're not the kind of formal strategic or scenario planning process that you would go through with your leadership team and your board. This is kind of much more of a quick and dirty look, trying to figure out kind of where we stand, kind of give us some basic kind of information around how long are we going to go before we're going to run out of cash, right? That's an important decision point or an important data point to help inform our decisions, right? But we're not going to come up with 3 really detailed strategic, scenarios about what will happen if that. This is going to be a much more, I think, very much hands-on, kind of down and dirty, very much of a practical-based session for folks today. So I'm going to really focus much more on the contingency planning. There are groups that do strategic planning. There are groups that do great scenario planning work. And it might be appropriate for you to kind of work with a consultant or somebody who does that type of work, at some point. But for many of you, your focus really on a much, much shorter time horizon. And what you're really doing is what we're calling contingency planning. And so when I think about contingency planning, why we kind of want to think about this is it presents a way that it kind of gives us this kind of scope of our universe of what could potentially happen on a short-term basis. And then it allows us to kind of really communicate, I think particularly explicitly communicate in financial terms, what's going to happen if this happens, this is what the financials are going to look like. And if this happens, this is what the financials are going to look like. And so it gives us, again, what this is really ultimately about is getting really good data. So, so we can oftentimes project, I'm going to show one thing where we're looking at kind of a plan B and a kind of worst case, as well as, kind of what our standard budget is. So again, we're not doing a formal scenario planning where we're kind of options A, B, and C, but having some alternatives to say, okay, if we did this, how would that look versus if we did this, how would that look? So you may have a situation where, you have 2 different options, and depending on how the cash flow goes, depending on how your funding goes, you may say, okay, if we don't get this funding by June, we're going to have to switch to plan B and reduce some programs, reduce some things like that. Or if that money does come in, then it allows us to do these other things. So again, we're focused on a short-term time horizon. And we're trying to identify what I think about as these triggers. What are these triggers that are going to kind of kick us from one step to the next? And so if something happens and we're able to get to free up some resources internally, okay, great, this is what we will do. If not, then these are the other things that we're going to do. And so the idea about when we hit that trigger and what that point is for us, for each organization, that's going to be very, very different. But we'll share some examples today of how some organizations have worked through that. That's what we just talked about, so I'm good there. Sometimes sometimes my presentations get ahead of my slides because I know what I want to say, but I'm not paying attention to my slides. All right. There are two ways that I'm going to do contingency planning for us all today. One is I'm going to actually use our cash flow forecast. The other, I'm going to use a budget, because both of these are tools that all of you should have. It doesn't involve the audit or 990 or anything like that. Again, we're focused on kind of current situation, short-term planning here. Now, this cash flow template I have up here is I adapted this from Propel Nonprofits, which is formerly called the Nonprofit Assistance Fund. Fiscal Management Associates, Nonprofit Finance Fund, Nonprofit Partnership. I'm sure there's tons of resources and examples of cash flow statements that you can get for nonprofit organizations. One of the things I wanted to point out in this particular model, which is why I like to use it, is it makes a distinction between unrestricted cash and restricted cash. Because again, remember I said earlier that if money's coming in and it's restricted for 2020, it's restricted for your endowment, it's not, you can't cover your payroll and salaries and pay your light bills with that. So we need to make sure we're not seeing all this cash come in, thinking we have all this cash, and really it's all restricted. So this model here, what it does is makes this distinction between unrestricted and restricted cash. And again, we're going to be providing all of this information all to you. So you will have all of these slides that we'll show you. So here you have an organization that, again, you see, here's where their cash flow. Let me walk folks through this very briefly. Right, we start off the month with in January, we're this calendar year, that this organization at $71,000 in cash, unrestricted cash. And then what happened is, right, we got some new grants, some program revenue comes in. They have some special events that they do, some fundraising events. So you can see they get some foundation grants, they get some individual contributions, they do some special events, and they also have some program. Now this happens to be particularly a school-based program. I can't remember right off if it's an after-school program or early childhood education. I think it's an after-school program where they do some work and that they get reimbursed for that. And so they have their kind of program fees as well. And then this is the cash coming in. That's all up here in the green section. And then the cash going out. And we've lumped these together in kind of major categories. You can have a much more detailed breakdown of kind of how your cash is going out. But for the illustrative purposes of today's session, I wanted to kind of simplify it a little bit. So we have our personnel, our professional fees, that's our accountants and our audits and consultants, our occupancy cost, our rent, utilities, maintenance, other office expenses, your phones, your paper clips, postage, all of that kind of stuff. And then if there's any kind of direct programmatic expenses that the organization has, that's all being captured here. So in this particular case, we started at 71,000. We had, what's that, $56,000 come in and $65,000 go out. So at the end of the month, our cash actually dropped by over $9,000, right? Because we only had 56 come in and 65 go out. So in terms of our unrestricted cash, it has actually dropped. But they also received a grant at the beginning of the fiscal year from a foundation for $85,000. But this grant is a restricted programmatic grant, and you can see here, a portion of it is going to be distributed here in June, another portion in September, and then the final $50,000 was scheduled to be released in December. So they have this $85,000 come in, but it's not available to cover salary and light bills yet, right? They're not even going to be able to release any of this money to at least June at this point. So what happens is when you come back up here then the beginning of February, what happens? Well, you see a total of $146,000 in cash, but remember, a big hunk of that is restricted. So in terms of unrestricted cash, this organization, again, actually dropped from one month to the next. So our unrestricted cash actually dropped. So this is a great example where total cash can go up, but unrestricted cash can actually be dropping, which is the number that we need to be paying attention to. And a lot of groups muddle those together, and it's very hard to make decisions when all of that cash just gets pushed together. So what are we seeing with this organization? So one of the things that we see is that if we look in this April to kind of July timeframe right in here, we see that there's a big special event that they have. They bring in almost $220,000 in this big special event that they have in June. Now, this is actually not dissimilar. All Stars Helping Kids, we always, in June, we have our celebrity golf tournament, which has gotten canceled, of course, which was supposed to be next Monday. And so for us, same thing. We had budgeted a bunch of revenue from that, and that's not going to happen. And now this group is probably going to have something similar. Because again, right, it was right at early to mid-March when the shelter-in-place orders, the shutdown started to really happen and impact people. And definitely by the end of March, right, things were pretty much, locked down, particularly here in California. And so they had this big special event, and they also, again, had about $70,000 over this period from fees from a school-based program. So we know that once COVID hits, all of this stuff is going to go away, right? And that's exactly kind of what happened. So with that, whoops, let me go back one slide. So with that while the organization was looking at a potential kind of drop in cash in May and June on an unrestricted basis, that was really going to rebound after this special event. So this is not unusual where you see a lot of organizations spending all the money up front for their special event. And then when the event comes in, it kind of, again, replenishes their coffers. And that they were going to end the year cash flow positive. If you look over in December, they look like they're in great shape. Again, very similar to where they started the year. So they were able to actually move through the year and be cash flow positive. However, once that money that they had budgeted, right, for that special event, it was supposed to be $220,000. Now it's down to half of that, because they still had some funders who said, okay, hey, fine, we'll still give you the money. We'll fund you. Some individuals said, we'll still give you the money. So they were able to still secure some, or at least they're hoping at this point, because this is, again, this forecast was done at the end of, this was done in March. So in March, as they were starting to shut down, they started to look forward and started to think and started to play around with, all right, we're going to this special events is going to get cut, but hopefully we can reach out to some donors and some funders and ask if they could still make those contributions for us. And so they're anticipating around 100,000, about less than 50% of their funding that they still might be able to secure. But all of those program fees, that $70,000 from the program fees, the school-based work, that's gone, right? The kids are no longer in schools. You're no longer doing the after-school programming. You're no longer getting reimbursed for any of that work. So that money has all gone away. And then, of course, what that has done is it has blown a significant hole in their budget. Now, all of a sudden, of a year that they were looking to potentially be cash flow positive, now they're looking at being in the hole, potentially on an unrestricted basis, at least, as much as $100,000. So this, in some ways, gives us our kind of worst case scenario here, right? If no other money comes in, if just what we projected has come in, and we really, are not able to kind of get, any additional money, our kind of worst case scenario here is that we're going to end the year kind of in a significant kind of negative cash position. Now, we don't know at this particular case how much reserves this organization has, other access to capitals it does. But what we know now is based on our initial kind of planning and kind of initial estimates is that we could look at a very significant kind of negative cash position. So what are some things that we could potentially do to think about how we could address and try and close that gap, and kind of shrink it down to something that's probably potentially much more manageable. And so one of the things that we're going to look at is that restricted grant. Now, and again, many of you may have already done this. I think a lot of other foundations have known this, is that when they're giving restricted programmatic grants, what they've done is gone back and unrestricted that, allowed the organization to kind of use that as general operating support during this COVID-19 crisis. So one of the things that we're, and at this point, again, this is a scenario plan that was put together in March. They weren't 100% sure this was going to happen yet. So, but that's one of the things they really wanted to look at, to understand if we could do that, how would that impact kind of our cash flow for the organization. The other thing that we obviously had to look at is what's right here, is these programmatic expenses. Now, again, these are expenses that were directly associated with those after school programs. Maybe the supplies, food, meals, bus transportation, teachers that were going to teach that program, right? Whatever that is that was having in there, we had a set of expenses now the question is, do we keep those expenses in, keep people employed, keep them on our payroll, kind of continue to, maintain all of those, or do we end up cutting that? And so that's one of the things we're also going to look at. And again, see how that starts to kind of impact our overall cash flow as an organization. Then the other area we want to start to think about is those professional fees. Now, one of the things you see here is you see this big jump up in professional fees in May. Like, what's that? Well, most often that is your event planner, your consultants that you're using for your fundraising event, maybe speaker fees or other things that you're paying people to come in and do your event. So there's a bunch of cost in here. We may have to also look in there and say, again, what costs can we kind of cut out of this? Because our goal here is really focusing on this kind of saving the cash within the organization. So this organization said, okay, option one is obviously we're going to be cutting our programmatic expenses. They felt they couldn't, given the size of that deficit, given the size that they're looking at, given that these programs are, we know are not going to be at least back in school until at least September at the earliest, they decided to let those teachers go, kind of cut those expenses, cut the contracts that they could, and save that much of cash here. In addition, right, we also then said, okay, what if we brought that grant forward? They had some preliminary conversations with their funder, and they said, okay, I think we can do that. I think, that's a lot of the recommendations that are being made is around, being kind of more flexible in our funding for that. And so if they pushed that, kind of brought that money forward into May, that was scheduled to not be really released until the end of the year, how does that kind of impact our budget numbers? And when we do just those two things, one of the things that we see is that we have a significantly different kind of cash flow situation. Right? We go from ending the year at negative $100 and something thousand to ending the year at around negative $11,000, $12,000. Now, right, so we have that we had our kind of worst case scenario, which is we're going to be $100,000 in the hole. Now we have kind of, our plan B, or kind of a better case scenario, where we're still going to kind of be in a negative cash flow position. Remember, originally, our original forecast had us at $70,000 positive cash flow. And now we're at a negative, $11,000. So it's an $82,000 swing in their cash flow, which is fairly significant for an organization of this size. So, but an $11,000 gap is something that is going to be much, much easier to close than a $100,000 gap. You could potentially, fundraise for that. You could obviously think about looking at some other expense areas where you may be able to make reductions and kind of capture that. If they have access to something like a line of credit, or you know, some kind of you know, some opportunity. Now groups are taking things like the payroll protection plan loans, or EIDL loans, or other kind of emergency relief loans to help, again, kind of close that gap that they're having. But what we've now got is these kind of two cases, right? We have this worst case scenario that we looked at, and now we have kind of a slightly better case scenario that we're thinking about. If we can pull that grant forward, we'll cut the programmatic expenses. And then the area we haven't really even talked about yet was a lot of these kind of professional fees. Now, some of these things may have been things that we, you know, if we're thinking like, well, we may push that special event into the fall, so we still want to, you know, pay our kind of event planner, so that, you know, we just kind of pay for them to kind of help us reschedule this. Or do we really just cancel this and just, you know, kind of get out of that contract, get back any money that we potentially have? We've had a number of our nonprofits, you know, when they've canceled events, been trying to get kind of any prepaid deposits or other money kind of back from that, given the nature of the whole COVID crisis. So this one, we're still not quite sure of. Again, at this point, we're actually in March when we were doing this planning. But if we ended up kind of cutting some of those expenses that we had around that special event, right, how would that really, again, impact our cash flow as we were going through the year? So you can start to see here, you have all these different levers that we can start to kind of push and play and develop a bunch of different scenarios of what's going to happen. And again, this isn't some big formal process, right? This is usually a much quicker, well, what happens if we did that? What if we did this? And if you have, again, things like PPP loans, lines of credit, right? What happens if you kind of draw on those? Now, again, with fees and loans, you also oftentimes have fees with that. Obviously, interest, you know. So I will always say that debt is not a substitute for revenue, right? You can take on debt like a line of credit if it's a timing delay. If you know the money's coming in and it's just not here yet, then borrowing maybe a line of credit or something like that for cash flow needs is appropriate. But if it's just a cash hole, if it's just a hole in your budget and you're borrowing to kind of cover for that, that's a very dangerous situation. Because at best, if a nonprofit is able to actually be profitable, at best, you're really typically looking at an average of something around 3 to 5% profitability. And if you're paying 5 to 8% on a loan and you're only getting 3% profits, that means you're actually going to have to take money out of your operating budget to pay that interest back. And we don't want to have that happen. So, but these are the types of things that you can start to do now. From here, we can start playing with a whole different set of levers and moving things around and seeing, well, what about this if we push these out? If we, you know, if we kind of don't pay this now and hold off on this, how can that go through our kind of cash flow? And ultimately, where would that put us for at the end of the year? So I think this is a really, cash flow forecasting is actually a really powerful contingency planning tool. Because what it does for us is it gives us this kind of very explicit, right? It's right there in big red letters, you know, definitely, you know, negative cash flow. And that really tells us and helps us to inform vision. Now, this board may say, you know what, we have some money in the reserves that we can absorb a kind of hit like that, and we're okay moving forward. We don't have to make any additional cuts at this moment, in which case the organization could potentially move forward. Or the board may be saying, yeah, listen, we're really in a precarious financial position. We're not going to be able to take that hit. We're going to have to make cuts now. And again, where are you going to make those cuts to kind of start to reduce that cash flow need? So I want to stop there and see if there's any questions. I know a couple of things have popped up in the chat box. Let me see, I'm going to take a moment to just read them and see if there's any questions. But if people have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box and I'll try and see if I can get them. Okay. During the month, So this is a good question. So what they're talking about is, you see here, the first 3 months were actuals, right? We actually had the actuals through May, and then we were doing the through March, and we were doing this. So the question that they were asking is that when you're looking at these numbers here, both in terms of revenue and expenses, are we doing this on what they consider a cash basis, or are we doing this on an accrual basis? Now, what that means, an accrual basis or GAAP accounting usually accounts for things like pledges, right? So somebody gives us a pledge, in which case in here, we actually have tracking that in this grants anticipated category. These are things where they're kind of pledges and we're anticipating them, but we don't have confirmed kind of grant agreements for them. So we wanted to split them out between what we know is coming in, what has been confirmed, and what are those things that are really still, we've had some conversations, we're anticipating that money coming in, but it's not been signed, sealed, and delivered yet. And for our expenses, I think it's very important that you think about when does the cash actually go out? Because sometimes we have things like insurance payments that we pay quarterly. But when we put them in our budget, we usually take whatever the annual amount is, we just divide it by 12. But that's not actually how cash comes in and out of the organization. So with some of these expenses, if they're going to hit every quarter, that's really where you want to put them. You really want to put them in the month where the cash is actually going to go out the door, or when the cash is really going to come in the door. So to the extent that possible, this is really much more of an actual, when do we actually think that cash is really going to kind of go out the door? And so if we have things that are annual payments, quarterly payments, semi-annual payments, put them in the appropriate month and don't just kind of spread that across 12 months. And I think because the more accurate the kind of data going into this cash flow forecast, the better data you're going to have and the better decisions you're going to be able to make. All right. See if there's, okay.
That's the only question I saw so far.
All right, so far. So I must be doing a great job. Got everybody either educated or asleep. So we'll figure it out.
I think we're all on board. Yeah.
You're all on board. Fantastic. Yeah. So that's cash flow. That's kind of contingency planning using a cash flow forecast. And so because what that again is, and again, when I had this, when you actually have the template, you can have kind of, scenario A, B, and C, 3 different tabs. And for each of those tabs, you can kind of play with what are the criteria here. But this is really for organizations that are particularly on a cash basis, smaller nonprofits that don't have a lot of definitely like liquidity and reserves. We don't have those multi-million-dollar endowments and things like that. Where for us, ending the year kind of cash positive really is the difference between whether we're going to be able to pay our employees or not. And so in that particular case, something like that, then doing your contingency planning, really using a cash flow forecasting model is, I find very effective and very useful because it really tells you particularly exactly when you're going to run out of cash, how long you're going to be able to go. Oh, if I go back here, again, even in this situation, right? If all of a sudden, these grants in July and August all of a sudden don't show up or get pushed, right? What's that going to do again to our cash flow through here? And so it really tells us, it really becomes explicitly clear when those trigger points are. If everything happens here according to our plan, we know we really have till the end of September to kind of figure it out, because after September, we're starting to go negative cash flow. And we're going to start to kind of be in this kind of behind the 8 ball. So that tells us how long we have to really kind of find a solution and kind of raise that money or cut our expenses. And then again, as we go through, if things are happening, we want to kind of make this real world adjustments to make sure that we're kind of tracking along. So cash flow forecasting, I think, is the kind of, most nitty gritty, hands-on, real-time planning that you're going to do. Sometimes groups are doing that, well, if not monthly, maybe even weekly, depending on your cash flow situation. But the other one I wanted to kind of talk about is the tool that most of us actually use on a day-to-day basis for just kind of financial management is our budgets. That really is, for most nonprofit leaders, our kind of day-to-day tool for that. Now, I'm actually going to use the example of All Stars Helping Kids. So this is my organization. This is our budget. I've kind of condensed it all a little bit for everybody. But this is the original budget that I kind of came in beginning of this fiscal year. And we're October to the end of September. So October 1 to September 30th. So here was our approved budget. We had a $1.5 million revenue coming in. We have individuals, corporate contributions. A lot of those corporate contributions were related to some special events we were planning to do. And then corporate and kind of the grants and contributions as well. This is really, this was, a lot of this was some sponsorship money for our special events. And so our total kind of revenue budget was about 1.5 million. You look at our expenses here, including the grants we're making out to our nonprofit partners and others in here, and then kind of our total expenses. So we were looking pretty much at a break-even budget, a small, tiny little surplus that came in. But as we got through the end of February, right, and we got into March, we quickly realized there was a couple things. We had a fundraising event at the end of March, had to cancel that. We have our big kind of celebrity golf tournament in June. Again, we were anticipating right away that was probably going to be canceled. So right away, we knew there was going to be a big hunk, a big kind of gap thrown into our budget in terms of our revenue, losing revenue. In addition, though, as a grant maker, one of the other things that we committed is that we put together our rapid response fund. And we pledged to put $150,000 out to our grantees to help them kind of navigate through the whole COVID crisis. And that's what you see this rapid response fund here. This was not in the original budget, which is why it's red. But you can see in the original budget, I didn't have that, right? So now I've lost $300,000 in revenue, and I've added $150,000 in expenses all of a sudden because of COVID. So I'm like, all right, now this budget that I have is kind of totally been shot to heck. So the first thing we did is really got together as a team and started to kind of think about, okay, what do we have already committed through the end of February? What money we think is going to kind of go away, and then let's look at some of our expenses. So as we kind of look at this here, you can see that as our actuals to the end of February, we were maybe about a third of the way to our kind of goal. Through that, again, recognizing we have a fundraising event in March and a fundraising event in June. But we knew that kind of went away, right? That we recognized that those sponsorships and those things we were going to do for those special events were probably going to go away. Now, again, we might pick up some of that money kind of flowing in as individual contributions, or groups may say, hey, we're not going to be able to sponsor the golf tournament this year, but we'll go ahead and give you that $25,000 as a grant anyway. So we anticipated some kind of uptick in just kind of grants from people that were not going to be funding the event. But that event, kind of all of that money goes away as well. And we have a kind of holiday special event that we did as well. So all of a sudden, when we kind of looked at my revenue forecast, I went from about 1.5 million down to 1.2 million, a drop of $363,000 in expenses, in revenue that we had for that event. So that all kind of gets cut out of my budget. Then down here, initially, we had just budgeted $50,000 for our kind of rapid response fund. It ended up being $150,000 that we kind of pushed out the door. But in the beginning, we kind of really just set that as our goal. Again, this was put together really kind of early March before we knew a lot of what was going to be going on. So I had some additional expenses here. But I was also able to cut out a lot of the expenses that were associated with the golf tournament and our other kind of fundraising events we were going to do in March. So the March and June events, we were able to say, okay, well, we're not going to do all of that, so we don't have to do all of the things that are going to be involved with that. And so we were able to cut out a real huge big hunk of our expenses just from that line item there. So we were very fortunate that if this had happened just a couple of weeks later, we would already kind of entered into contracts, we'd already put deposits down, we would have had money out the door, which would have been much, much harder to recover, as many of you who are kind of in that situation know. So we kind of made a series of cuts and reductions. You can see across personnel, kind of freezing, consultants and contractors and doing kind of other things to help reduce some expenses. We cut all those special kind of event expenses and made some other kind of operating expense reductions. So I was able to basically kind of find about $360,000 of expenses that I could kind of cut out. Actually, I had to cut out more than that because I added some expense. So probably about $400,000 in expenses I needed to cut out so that I could both fund my grant program and continue to fund the rest of the organization, but still hit what at least we were kind of thinking of as basically same break even, potentially a small deficit. So this was our plan B that we initially developed for kind of our response to COVID-19, our response to our fundraising events being canceled, and the kind of whole kind of donor kind of fundraising disruption that we have. But then I was going to go into my finance committee meeting, and I knew what my finance committee chair was going to want is he wants to see kind of what's the worst case scenario, right? What's the number that we're going to need to hit the absolute bare bones minimum? And so then we really kind of worked to put together this kind of worst case scenario. And so for this, we were saying, well, okay, if this money that we're anticipating another $750,000 between March and September was to come in, if that really is only saying, we looked at it and said, who are the people that we know absolutely going to support us? We have that money, even though it's not in yet, we know they'll be there for us. And just pretty much tried to take out everything else that we didn't really have really strong faith that it was going to come in. And that pushed us down, another kind of hunk of money down to about $960,000. Now, again, my original budget's 1.5, almost 1.6 million. I cut it to 1.2 million as a kind of plan B. And then as our plan C, our kind of a worst case scenario, we cut it down to under $1 million. And that's a drop of revenue out of a $1.5 million budget of $600,000. It's like 40% cut in our budget. So this is a very, very significant kind of decrease in our revenue streams for us. So again, I went in and said, okay, where could we cut? Where could we reduce expenses? What are things we could, potentially save some money on? Maybe things we could push out into the 2021 fiscal year to help us save some money. And I was able to actually find some places that we could cut. And one of my major objectives when I was cutting was I really wanted to retain all of my staff, my full-time staff. I'm fine like not hiring consultants or not bringing on those interns or things like that, but I really wanted to keep my kind of existing staff base in that. And so that was my primary really kind of goal up here. So I really tried to minimize any cuts I could in terms of around personnel. But we were able to reduce some expenses without reducing any kind of headcount. But the rest of my programs, you see, really, everything kind of gets cut across the board. And that's why ultimately I'm able to kind of make some significant cuts. I am now looking at something like a $35,000 to $40,000 deficit kind of under our worst case. And so for us, what this kind of, to me, this is our kind of bare bones kind of, this is where we would still be able to kind of maintain our existing bare kind of programmatic work, maintain our staff. But this doesn't give us, this really sends us into 2021 in a kind of shaky position. We're not rebuilding, we're not really kind of replenishing our coffers. We're pulling money down from our reserves. We're fortunate to have some reserves. So we would have to be pulling money out of our reserves. And that just means we go into the new fiscal year kind of at this kind of much kind of smaller state than we really want to be in. But talking with our development director, talking with our finance chair, talking with our board chair, really going through, we felt this 960, 950, 960 number was something that we were very, very confident we could hit that number. So if we could keep our expenses in the $1 million range, we felt that this would be, this is not going to be the greatest option that we have, but we can cover that gap. We have the kind of liquidity, the reserves that we need. We can pull some money out of that board designated fund, and that could get us through this year. But that means we're starting next year with a kind of depleted reserves, kind of minimal staff. We haven't done any of the investing in any of our systems or processes or people, right? So we're coming into the next year in a fairly weakened position, but we've lived to fight another day. Again, going back to that idea of doing what we need to do to kind of maintain a certain minimum level of programming. Because one of the things I often talk about when I do my nonprofit finance training is this idea of no money, no mission, right? If we don't have that reliable recurring money, we're not going to actually be able to support our mission. But the flip side also happens when you're thinking about these contingency plans and cutting and reducing expenses. One of the things, if we've reduced our expenses so much that organizations no longer think of us as being delivering on mission, or you guys aren't really doing your work, then what starts to happen, no mission, no money, right? So all of a sudden then people stop giving and stop donating because they see that you're actually cutting all of the very programs that they're kind of supporting and funding for you within your organization. So that's why we didn't really want to have to cut back our programs too much, because that's really why our funders are funding. We start closing down our grant programs, well then why are people giving us money? And so we were caught in this kind of, no mission, no money bind. So we needed to make sure that we can maintain our programs, but not do it, do it at the kind of barest minimum level. So this is now something that every single month I'm coming in and reforecasting for our finance committee. And so far, these numbers have pretty much been playing out. So here we are, we just wrapped up May. I'm coming into June. I'm about to do my reforecast for June for this. But so far, the numbers are coming very, very close to what we had projected. So we're continuing to stay kind of really on this kind of what we're calling our plan B right here. But we recognize if things go south, there are other cuts and other things that we can make. So this right now is kind of where we are. So when you're thinking about this, you could, if you wanted to put a third case in here, you wanted to have A, B, and C, absolutely fine and doable. But this is a nice way to do it where you can kind of see everything looked in. Now, when we were looking at cash flow, right, it was really just about keeping cash in the organization and just maintaining that cash to kind of keep the lights on and the doors open. This level, when you're kind of taking it up a level and focusing on the overall budget, is more around this idea of how do we kind of maintain our programmatic mix and our staffing is to the fullest extent possible while bringing our expenses in line with revenue realities. And that's really what we've done here. And you can see this is nothing fancy. There's no kind of, we didn't need to hire a consultant and go through some strategic value exercise and all of these types of things. We didn't spend 6 months going through a strategic planning process to figure out that I'm $300,000 in the hole. And so I knew that. We figured that out fairly quickly. We put the numbers back on. We put them on a piece of paper. And now when I present this, what you're seeing up here on the screen when I'm presenting this to our finance committee or my board of directors, they now have data to help them make decisions. And they can kind of poke and prod and see what's going on, but they have an idea of like, okay, this is roughly what the potential kind of realm of possibilities are for, at least for all stars, and allowed them. For us, this very much gave them comfort to kind of stay the course. I think that's what really came out of this board meeting, this finance committee meeting, was like, okay, you know, we've taken this $300,000 hit, loss of our fundraising events, but we've been able to kind of offset that with some necessary expense reductions and kind of rebalance the budget. And so if our numbers continue to hit as we're hitting every month, we're going to stay with this. For us, it was really kind of coming into June, where we figured if we can get through June, we really felt we could get through the rest of the year, and that things would be okay. So, knock on wood, we're almost there. We're not quite out of the woods yet, but I'm definitely feeling a little bit more breathing room than I had just 2 or 3 months ago. All right, I want to stop there again. We got about 20 minutes left. There's just about 2 or 3 more points I want to hit, but I want to make sure if there's any, I saw some questions pop up in the chat box.
Actually, no questions just yet. I know.
Okay.
I think we got some comments of they're riveted, which is good.
They're riveted.
They're very engaged,
That's good.
liking the information. Yes, I think we're doing okay. But yes, if you have any questions, please post them up in that Q&A box, and we will definitely give it our best chance to answer them.
Well, then one of the last things I wanted to talk about when you're thinking about contingency planning, and this to me, this is where I've seen groups kind of get into trouble, is they start to look at, well, okay, as you saw back when I was doing the kind of overall budget, I didn't really break this out by program. So some folks say, well, how can we look at our individual programs and figure out which of these programs are making money, which of these programs are losing money, and then how can I make sure that if a program's losing money, maybe that's where we have to reduce expenses. And so groups want to do this kind of analysis at a programmatic level. And so there are a couple things I want to say about that. First off is that in many, many ways, our core mission business of most nonprofits is never really going to be a profitable business, right? If we could make money providing domestic violence services, we'd all be for-profit corporations, but you can't, right? So running a domestic violence shelter, running a homeless shelter, right? Providing some of the services that we do for homelessness or other kind of high need populations, right? It's not profitable work. That's why we need philanthropy. That's why we need grant making. We may have some earned revenue in there, but at the end of the day, this work needs to be subsidized through kind of grant funding. So that we recognize just because a program is losing money doesn't mean we're going to cancel it, because that oftentimes is our core mission work. And again, no mission, no money. So, but the challenge for us is this idea that if a program goes away, what revenue and expenses really go away with it? Because what we often do in our program budgeting is we allocate expenses across everything based on percentage of, the percentage of the development director, percentage of the executive director. We put all of these expenses into these program budgets, but if we cut that program, not all of those expenses go away. Right, the organization still has to pay its mortgage bill, right? Regardless of how many people you're seeing in your after-school program, right? Even if it's zero, your mortgage payment is still your mortgage payment. So, understanding if a program goes away, what expenses and other really go away with it, and so part of this analysis now. Nonprofit Finance Fund has a tool. So again, Nonprofit Finance Fund, I used to, my former employer, they have a great tool called a program profitability model that they use to actually break this assessment down. I know other organizations like Fiscal Management Associates, FMA, Fiscal Management Associates, also has a similar tool. I think Propel Nonprofits has a similar tool. There's lots of tools out there that kind of do this kind of program-based budget model. And the model that I'm actually going to use, the example I'm about to show you, is actually from Fiscal Management Associates. It's available for free, actually, on a website called strongnonprofits.org. Strongnonprofits.org. And again, all of those resources are in the slides at the end of this presentation that you all will make available to everybody. So this idea, this tool that I kind of want to show you, it kind of explains, helps to break down like what we're really looking at when we're looking at a kind of program-based budget model. Again, this is what they call program-based budget model, a program-based budget tool from Fiscal Management Associates. Many other organizations have very, very, very similar tools. Nonprofit Finance Fund has theirs, etc. So we have program A, B, right? So we have two programs. Say one, let's just say one's early childhood education, the other's after school programming. Fantastic. We have management in general. So M and G is management in general. It's our quote unquote overhead expenses. And then we have our fundraising or development costs, and then the total cost for this organization. So here we have program A is $178,000 roughly. Program B is about $160,000. We have management in general, and we have fundraising expenses for a total budget of $457,000. But when we're looking at this budget, there's a couple of things that we need to really understand about it. One is that what are the real, true, direct expenses that go away if that program goes away? Now, in this particular case, there are things like, well, if this is an early childhood education program and you cancel your early childhood education classes, you don't need the teacher. That expense goes away. Or if you're doing the after school programming, and the same thing, right? If you're no longer doing the after school programming work, you no longer need that teacher. That's an expense that goes away. Same with things like the bus rental to bring in the students, snacks for the students, any kind of specific classroom supplies, any type of things like that. Things that if that program goes away, all of those expenses actually go away with it. But then you also have these shared or allocated expenses. And this is what gets people in trouble, right? Because if we look up here, if we look at our executive director or our program director, right? If you cut a program or reduce a program, you're not also reducing the executive director's salary by that amount, right? You're not reducing the program director's salary. You're not reducing the development director's salary. None of those expenses go away. Right? Along with any kind of the fringe or the benefits, the kind of payroll taxes, and retirement savings, all of that, those costs as well. Along with things like rent and utilities and depreciation. These are costs that get allocated across programs, but they're not true direct program expenses in the sense of contingency planning, at least now. For your grant budget, yeah, we're going to say they're all direct expenses, right? We're going to say these are all essential program expenses. But the reality is, if we close our after school program, we still have to pay our mortgage, we still have to pay our rent, we have to pay our utilities, we're paying for depreciation, right? None of those are fixed, what they call fixed costs, right? Whereas the direct expenses are variable. You know, if your programs increase, those costs increase. If your programs decrease, those costs decrease. Whereas your fixed costs stay the same regardless of how many programs that you have. And then, of course, there's the true overhead, kind of indirect management and general expenses, which obviously also do not go away, right? You're still going to need your bookkeeper. You're still going to need to do the audit. You're still going to need to do the 990, right? You're still going to be, spending money on kind of fundraising events and doing things like that. So even whatever happens over here in your programmatic side doesn't really impact what's happening over on the fundraising and kind of management side. So you actually have three categories of expenses. We have direct expenses that actually go away with the program. We have allocated expenses that if that program goes away, those expenses get reallocated to the remaining programs. And then we have our indirect and overhead expenses, which really kind of don't have any impact directly usually with the programmatic work. And they're just costs that we continue to spend regardless. Or we can cut those expenses and they don't really have direct impact on the kind of programmatic work. So I just want to caution folks that when you're looking at program budgets and kind of these program-based tools, to be cognizant that, oh, this program's losing money, let's just close it down. We're going to save all this money. And in the end, you don't end up saving anything. You just get rid of the revenue. And that's not what we do, right? Cutting revenue and keeping expenses is not the way to sustainability. So we need to really be careful that we actually understand what programs and costs really go away. All right. We got questions, we got chats, we got all kinds of things. We got 10 minutes to go. Let me open the Q&A here. One of the questions here is around kind of layoffs and reducing staff salaries and all of that. And yes, I absolutely think that, you know, for a lot of times, one of the first steps that groups are going to take, kind of hiring freezes, kind of freezes and any kind of raises or bonuses or anything type like that, right? Just kind of put those kind of freezes across the board. That's usually the first kind of option. And then you may be asking senior staff or other folks to take a temporary pay reduction. Maybe you have all your senior program directors or whatever take a 10% reduction, again, to try and kind of, the goal here is to reduce that burn rate, right? How can we kind of, if we're burning through, you know, $120,000 a month, if we can drop that to $95,000 a month, that's going to really help extend our cash throughout the end of the year. So usually first things you're going to see are things like hiring freezes, salary freezes. Then you're going to see things like potentially asking staff to do some kind of across the board kind of salary reductions, at least on a temporary basis. And then if that still isn't enough, then yeah, you're going to have to look at kind of reducing personnel and reducing slots and cutting those. And again, I think that's when a lot of groups, when you're looking at those program things, to really be kind of aware that, okay, if we're really going to have to ramp this program down, then what expenses really kind of, if those folks are fully allocated out to those programs, then they may actually need to kind of go away as well. And then you could kind of see the impact of each level. So you could have an A, B, and C, the same kind of idea we've talked about. A is we're simply going to do a hiring freeze and salary freeze. And let's see what that does for our cash flow. Now, if you're a larger organization, you have 120 employees and you have cost of living increases built into your budget already, you have kind of promotions and bonuses built into your budget, right? All of a sudden, just doing that kind of hiring and salary freeze can have a significant savings on cash across the organization. And then having the kind of staff kind of take a temporary kind of pay reduction could be another way to kind of really help keep staff on in the organization, keep the mission work going, but allow it to reduce that burn rate to kind of extend your cash throughout at least get you through the end of the fiscal year. So that's great. I want to hit a couple more things and then I want to wrap up and make sure that I want to really respect everybody's time. A couple things I just want to say in general that's not directly related to kind of contingency planning, but is this idea that in times like this, in tough times like this, when you're engaging funders and donors, it is really, really important that you own your numbers, that you understand where you stand financially, what your cash position is, what your unrestricted cash position is, all right, when things are going to happen, what your budget numbers, what are your options. So when you come to a funder, you come to a donor, you can say, listen, we've already done this. This is what our numbers are looking like. This is where we are. Because I think that's going to really give donors and funders a much better comfort level that you're a good fiscal steward. Right, that you're somebody who understands the business model, you understand the kind of finance side of the house, and you've already taken action, and you're not just asking them to plug a hole, but you're asking them to kind of really be a partner to driving forward your work. But really owning and understanding your numbers, I think, is just critical, because I think donors and funders are going to hit from so many just emergency appeals and just ask for money that they just do not have enough resources to give everybody funding. And so a lot of what people are going to be focusing in on is, I want to give money where I can feel that this revenue is really going to be able to leverage and drive outcomes and impact. And so owning those numbers becomes really critical. The other thing I think is really important in this particular case is, do not apologize. Don't apologize for the cost what it takes you to do your work, or how hard it is, or how many people it is, right? You go to Starbucks and they charge you $17.50 for that latte. They don't apologize for the price of their coffee, right? And yet here you are, saving lives, impacting communities, making a much more just and sustainable world. We don't need to apologize for the cost of what it's doing this. In a situation like this, in a crisis like this, going out and getting 60 cents for something that costs $1 is only going to exacerbate the problem, is only going to make it worse, right? We can't continue to deliver on programming if we're only getting 80 cents for every $1 worth of work we have to deliver. So we have to say, hey, this is what it's costing us to do this work, and we need you to fund that cost. Because if you don't, right now, there's not enough other sources to close that gap, and we're not going to be able to continue to deliver that programming. And so I think sharing that information, sharing the cost with your board, sharing it with your funders, kind of articulating that financial story is very, very critical right now. I'm doing it from a cash flow, a budget, a program-based budget like we talked about, really shows that you understand your numbers. But at the end of the day, it's not about the numbers. I'm all about, numbers. But at the end of the day, it's all about impact, right? It's all about the outcomes, the people served, the communities in which you're working in, right? That's ultimately what you're going to be able to do. But the secret here is better linking your financial health with those program outcomes, and that helping folks understand they're one and the same. We need to be financially strong in order to deliver programmatic outcomes. And I think that's really, a critical message that we need to do. We need to get away from this old, stupid view of overhead. If anybody's seen this kind of graphic reinterpretation of the overhead rate from Propel Nonprofits, I think it's an amazing kind of way to think about it, right? Instead of thinking about it where you have programs here and fundraising over there, and never the two shall meet, right? This kind of looks like, oh, I could take the fundraising wedge out and our programs just continue to operate. That's not how it works, right? In reality, all of this work is interrelated, right? Our fundraising work, our kind of operational support services like finance and HR and the board, our kind of allocated and shared expenses that we talked about, as well as our direct programmatic work. Are really, every program has to cover its piece of every kind of slice of that pie. And that's really what this model is. Because at the end of the day, right, 100% of every dollar goes to impact. I guarantee you there's not one organization that's on this call where this is not true, right? And so every dollar that comes into your organization, it may not go to program, but it goes to the people, the systems, the structures that support those programs and derive impact. So when we think about what it really is costing our programs to do this, and we're asking for money, we need to make sure that we try and get as much of these things covered as humanly possible, recognizing that not all donors are going to get general operating support or flexible funding. But we have to think about it, because if we can't get all of these things covered, right, we're not going to be able to ultimately deliver on mission. So this is the situation where no money, no mission. And so thinking about all of these costs. This is my information here, David at allstarshelpingkids.org. A little bit of information about my organization, as well as if anybody is interested in doing a training or presentation or anything for your board or anything like that, you can kind of reach out to me here as well. Christina, I think we have a minute or two.
Yeah, we are
All right.
just right up to the wire. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And I echo, there's even a there's a mention in chat, really like the donor dollar impact revision chart. That is one of my favorite things to come out in recent years, is that
Yes.
revisioning of overhead and helping everybody see things in a different light. And 100% goes to impact is the best statement. Absolutely. So thank you so much for sharing
Thank
that.
you.
I know that we still have a few people here on the call. If you have any lingering questions, please post them up in the chat. We'll try and get to those in these last few minutes. I did also post in the chat so that everybody can take a look. If you go to tnpsocal.org/resources, the link, or resources library, the link is in the chat. You can actually download the slides for this presentation right now. So we uploaded them early, they're available now. The video will be processed and will be sent out later today. So it'll be sent out via email, posted up on our website, as well as social media. And of course, we're gonna post it up on social media a little bit later because we're trying to stay silent today in reference to BLM. And so we wanna make sure that we're listening more so than talking as much today. So David, I thank you so much for this information again, and for being such a consistent guide as we go through all of this uncertainty at this time. So thank you for walking us through the differences also between strategic planning and contingency planning. Makes a big difference. So you're getting a lot of thank yous there in the chat. And like we said, if you have any need for follow-up or questions or resources, email info@tnpsocal.org. If you have particular questions or seeking assistance from David, you have his contact information right there on the screen. So please do reach out to him. And we wish you all well, be safe, be well, and be listening. That's what we're going to be doing for a while, and we look forward to it. Thank you again, David, so much. Appreciate everybody out there. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.